We are rapidly approaching the release of Scream 7, and we continue on in our Scream franchise reviews as we're up to 2022's Scream, maybe better known as Scream 5. Let's talk about it. What's happening? What's happening? What's happening? Welcome back into JC's Movies, where you can see all kind of movie and TV show content with me, JC, here today to talk about Scream 5, aka Scream of 2022. The one-word title, I know, a little bit confusing at times. I like to just call it Scream 5. I've also heard it called 5 Cream because of the way that it was presented in the marketing with the 5 and then the 5 representing the S in the Scream title, which I always thought was pretty funny. But we're going to get into that movie here today. But before we do, just a quick reminder, if you haven't yet, be sure to take a second out, hit that subscribe button. Not only am I reviewing all the Scream movies in the lead up to Scream 7 and going to have plenty of Scream content in relation to Scream 7's release, we're also covering movie news updates here every weekday, Monday through Friday. So be sure you're subscribed to the channel if you're a fan of movies, especially within the superhero, comedy, and horror genres as we'll be talking today. That helps me grow the channel. And you can also help out just by hitting that thumbs up button. Giving this video a like helps it hit that YouTube algorithm so it can find other movie fans like you and me. And with my spiel out of the way, we'll get set to dive in to Scream 2022 version here, Scream 5. But before we do, obviously just forewarning, spoilers abound here before we get into it here momentarily, but a little background before we do. To me, this was my favorite movie theater experience for a Scream movie. Absolutely loved going to see this movie in theaters in 2022. Funny enough, we had 11 years in between Scream 3 and Scream 4, and then we had 11 years in between Scream 4 and this Scream here, Scream 5, if you will, as Wes Craven was, passed since Scream 4's release. So this is the first Scream movie that does not involve Wes Craven. Kevin Williamson not writing this one, but he was involved as, a consultant, executive producer, if you will, here for this movie. And this is the first movie under a new production company, as Paramount and Spyglass put out this Scream. Before it had always been, Dimension, Miramax. Of course, that kind of went by the wayside with the whole Harvey Weinstein issue, as it should have. But as I said, the first Scream movie, not directed by Wes Craven, so that certainly is a change for this one. You bring in the Radio Silence team, and you bring in a couple new writers with James Vanderbilt and Guy Busick, although Kevin Williamson was around to consult, and I still think you can feel some kind of Kevin Williamson influences here in this movie. But one of my favorite things about this one is just how much it calls back to that original Scream. I remember being in the theater just being absolutely giddy with all the references to the 1996 Scream, the way that the third act plays out, in reference to that movie as well. Just a lot of fun stuff here that really had me excited for this Scream movie. So enough of background, enough of me kind of babbling about it. Let's get into the plot so I can tell you exactly what I liked about this Scream, and I can wax poetic about it a little bit further because I really do enjoy Scream 2022, Scream 5, if you will. So like I said, spoilers abound, but we're going to get into this thing and we're going to run through the plot, and I'll give you my rating at the end of the review here. So beginning with the opening here, we get introduced to Tara, Jenna Ortega's character, getting a call on the landline. Very fitting. Very reminiscent of that original Scream. And yes, 2022, people still had landlines. Some people still do have landlines still today, I do believe. So I still buy that. And I think they do a good job of incorporating, technology here in the opening as well to go along with, her receiving a call on the landline, so to speak. And right away, you get Ghostface, asking her about her scary movie. And much like we talked about, in Scream 4, in that review, how things had changed from 2000 to 2011, that movie they were talking about torture porn. This movie, 11 years later, horror had changed again to now where we want to talk and poke a little fun at and deconstruct elevated horror a little bit, because Jenna Ortega's character of Tara, her favorite horror movie, she says, is The Babadook. And they'd continue to poke fun at that elevated horror genre a little bit throughout this movie, which personally I enjoyed. But right away from there, we get one of those callbacks to the original Scream movie, which I really loved when I saw it in theaters. I loved it again when I watched it here on my rewatch, and it stuck out to me. And that is, of course, as she's talking to Ghostface on the phone, she just, picks up the butcher knife out of the knife block, which is exactly what Casey Becker did, Drew Barrymore's character in the original Scream. First of many callbacks to that first movie, which I've talked about in the past. I'm a sucker for that nostalgia bait. I love going back and, highlighting, giving Easter eggs from one of my all-time favorite movies. So right away, I was bought in right at that moment and continuing on throughout this movie. And much like in that first film, when we get the kind of turn of Casey Becker saying, hearing, "I want to know who I'm looking at," from Ghostface. And that's kind of when the terror builds up. Here, we get the terror building up by Ghostface knowing her name already as she's on the phone, which immediately leads to her locking the house and setting the alarms via her phone, which, there's your example of updated technology being incorporated into this film as well. She thinks she's texting her friend Amber as she's on the landline. So yet again, incorporating some more of that technology. And we come to find out it's actually Ghostface because the text message comes through and it's like, "Answer the landline." Tara responds to her friend Amber, or so she thinks. "How did you know my landline was ringing?" And we just get Ghostface responding, "Answer the phone, bitch," as he has cloned Amber's phone, is what we come to find out there. And he is threatening to kill her friend Amber if she doesn't answer the questions correctly while she's on the phone. So, we get the game back on the phone here from Ghostface. But Tara does an excellent job of answering the questions correctly up until the very last question, as he asks who was the killer in the first Stab movie. Tara responds, "Billy Loomis." He responds, "That's incorrect. The correct answer is Billy Loomis and Stumacher," which, kind of calls back to that original movie when he tricked Casey Becker by asking who's the killer in Friday the 13th, knowing she would say Jason Voorhees, although his mother was the killer in the first Friday the 13th movie. So yet again, we get kind of that trick question thrown here in Scream 5, which leads to Ghostface popping out, of course, stabbing her a couple of times in the stomach, stabbing her through the hand as she attempts to fight back. And then we hear sirens approaching as she has kind of, contacted the police, via the updated technology that we talked about here in this movie. And Ghostface, though, is on top of her and slashing down. And as he slashes down, we get our title drop and a needle drop to go along with it. And so we think, oh man, Jenna Ortega was, kind of the fake out in this movie, much like Drew Barrymore was in the original. But of course, we would come to find out she survived that attack from Ghostface, which I think is the first time ever that we've had a fake out in the opening scene, and it's not a kill to begin the movie, which is something else that I thought was a nice touch because you really catch people off guard with that. From there, we are introduced to Sam Carpenter for the first time, Melissa Barrera's character as her, and Jack Quaid's character, who we come to find out is her boyfriend named Richie, are outside of their job. Like I said, they are dating. She gets a text message from her friend Wes, which I think it's, such a nice touch. They did name a character Wes in this movie, kind of in homage to Wes Craven, the legendary director. This was, as I said earlier, the first Scream movie that he wouldn't get to direct. But Wes informs her of Tara being stabbed, but tells her that she survives. This is kind of where we learn that Tara, the Jenna Ortega character that was attacked in the opening, is Sam's sister. And from there, we go to our first scene outside the school, which is very similar to what? The fountain scene that introduced our ensemble cast in the first Scream. A lot of this is kind of beat for beat, which I really enjoy personally. Like I said, I know some people hate on that. That's one of my favorite aspects of this film, as we are introduced to the ensemble in this film as well. We get introduced to Mindy and Chad, who are twins, brother and sister. And we come to find out they are also the niece and nephew of Randy Meeks. And I love that touch, having them be relatives of, one of the original characters. And then we have Wes, who is the one that texted Sam, as I talked about there previously. And we come to find out he's the son of Deputy Judy, who we were introduced to in Scream 4. We come to find out she's now the sheriff, taking over that role there in Woodsboro. Then we have Amber, who is played by Mikey Madison, and Liv as well to round out the friend group. And Liv is Chad's girlfriend. Chad, of course, played by Cuba Gooding's junior son, Mason Gooding. So we were introduced to kind of our high school cast, that ensemble that's going to make up this new generation here in Scream 5. And then from there, we go back to, Richie and Sam as they make their way to Woodsboro from, I believe they're coming from Modesto, if I'm not mistaken. Richie reveals to Sam on the way there that he's never seen the Stab movies. Sam informs him kind of the backstory, so a little bit of exposition, maybe catching up both him and the audience who doesn't know a ton about, the history of the Scream movies, although she's doing it through the Stab movies, which, I think that's a good way to do this here in this movie, as she basically informs him that every once in a while someone throws on a ghost face mask and attempts to recreate the events of the original Woodsboro murders. And I get a nice quote here as well. The last time that it happened was in 2011, which, for us as the audience kind of gives us a bit of meta humor there, because we know that's the last time that a Scream movie was made as well. And then that leads to Richie asking her, do you have any idea why someone wearing that ghost face mask would want to attack and try and kill your sister? She responds no, which we of course find out later in the movie is not exactly true. We'll get to that momentarily. Once Sam arrives, she kind of meets up with that friend group, that ensemble cast that we were introduced to earlier, and we find out that she used to babysit Chad, Mindy, and Wes. Once her and Richie make it to the hospital and everyone is introduced, we're kind of provided with that backstory. And then Amber, who was, a close friend of Tara, I guess we're kind of presented with the fact that she may be her closest friend. She reveals that Sam left Tara and the family as soon as Sam turned 18. So, Amber doesn't trust her, and Amber seems to be very protective of Tara as well. From there, some of that high school cast, that ensemble that we talked about, are at a local bar, and this is where we're introduced to Kyle Gallner in this film, his character of Vince, who has a bit of an interaction or an encounter, I guess you could say, with Chad, because we kind of learn that he tries to hit on Liv, who is now Chad's girlfriend, and the two had previously had a little fling over the summer. As that encounter happens, they're about to square up, it looks like, but Vince pulls out a knife on Chad, which leads to him getting kicked out of the bar out after that spat. Once he's outside, that's when we get the first needle drop of Red Right Hand. Gotta love that kicking in, makes it feel so Scream here in Red Right Hand. And I think it's especially a nice touch that as Red Right Hand plays is when we get Vince's death scene here as he's taken out by Ghostface with the song playing, which I think is a great touch here of this movie. And then back at the hospital, Sam wakes up beside Tara and sees that Richie is watching Stab on Netflix. As he says, he wants to be prepared, so he's trying to, catch up on the movies, learn about things. As he told her earlier, he had never seen the Stab movies, and I think that just now watching this in hindsight, it's a little bit funny to see a Paramount movie talking about somebody watching something on Netflix. As I'm recording this, Paramount and Netflix are currently in a bidding war trying to, purchase Warner Brothers. So that just made me laugh a little bit hearing, a Paramount movie reference Netflix so openly in this one, which, a little bit, time removed from it, but still yet, with the time that we're in now, it's just a little bit ironic. But from there, Sam kind of leaves the room momentarily, heads to another room. I believe it's a bathroom. She's kind of washing her face in a sink. And when she looks up in the mirror, we get something that would be kind of a recurring theme throughout this movie, and personally that I really liked, as she hallucinates, guess who? Billy Loomis in his bloody white tee and everything, just like we saw him last in the 1996 OG Scream classic. Skeet Ulrich is back, baby, as he tells her, you can't run from who you are, Sam. When are you going to tell her why all this is happening? Dropping hints to us as the audience, and super intriguing when you don't know why he would say that to her at this point. And of course, that would be revealed not long hereafter. But before we get there, of course, she receives a phone call from Amber's number. And we know from the opening, Amber's cell phone has been cloned. So it's very much not Amber, but it's Sam's first call from Ghostface, as he says, I had to get you back here somehow. And then we get a badass line from Sam, kind of reminiscent of the one-liners that we've talked about here in, the first 4 Scream reviews that we always get from Nev Campbell. Sam's very much that badass here in this movie, as she says, you want to fuck with me, come and get me. And of course, Ghostface follows through on that and obliges, pops out, right then emerges and attempts to attack her before she ultimately gets away. And then we have, a police officer running in to check the room. Ghostface isn't there. And I think at that point in the movie, especially upon your first watch, it kind of almost leads you to believe, well, she was just hallucinating Billy Loomis. Was Ghostface ever really there either? And I think that's a nice touch here by this movie as well, which then leads to us kind of finding out why she was hallucinating Billy Loomis, as I referenced there just a few minutes ago. And Sam goes into the room, talks to Tara alone in the hospital, and explains to her kind of the reason why their dad left, which is because Sam was in the attic, found some pictures and found some things, and found out that Sam was not Tara's dad's daughter. She was actually the daughter of Billy Loomis. And so she goes to confront her mom about this. And when she does, the dad is standing right behind her. He didn't know this either. So he finds out about it right then and he leaves. So she kind of blames herself for their dad leaving because, she confronted her mom about Billy Loomis being her father, leading to his departure. And so that's kind of why you realize, oh, that's why, Sam left. That's why Sam, she talks about how she got into drugs, got in trouble with the law all the time, and then left when she was 18. And we're kind of giving an explanation for all of those things right here in this little bit of an exposition dump, but plays really well here in kind of an emotional scene between Sam and Tara, as Tara kind of responds saying that she's angry because, she hadn't seen Sam for 5 years. And then Sam shows up here and dumps all this shit on her, after everything that she's been through. So you can kind of understand Tara's point of view there as well. As Sam exits the hospital room, she sees Richie outside and she's like, were you listening at the door? He's like, no. He's like, okay, yeah, I was listening at the door. So, he hears all of this too and kind of knows the situation now as well. And, Sam advises him to leave essentially, but he refuses to, despite, having learned all that. And so at this point, you kind of are like, oh, I'm behind Richie. What a good dude. What a good dude not to leave. We'll just say that for right now, right? But we know kind of how that plays out here in Scream 5. But from that scene, we get the reintroduction of Dewey. David Arquette, very much back in this movie. Of course, when we're introduced to him here, he's living in a trailer looking, slightly disheveled, I guess you could say. When Sam and Richie show up at his place, he, originally doesn't want to talk to her. And then, she claims she's Billy Loomis's daughter. And he tells him, he'll give him a couple of minutes. We find out that he and Gail are no longer together, but he's still, watching her TV program every morning. So, that love is very much still there, present between the two. When they come in, Dewey begins asking her questions about Richie and then tells him, there were certain rules to surviving a stab movie. And we get the obligatory rules scene here, which rule number 1 tells us why he was questioning her so much about Richie, because his first rule was never trust the love interest. And then rule number 2, the killer's motive is always connected to something in the past. And then rule number 3, which he says is the most important rule, the first victim always has a friend group that the killer is a part of. And so gotta love the fact that we get the rules scene here yet again in this one. Obviously, Randy's not around, so we kind of get it from Dewey, but we also get it from a Randy relative here momentarily as far as some different rules, which we'll get to here in a minute. But Sam then asks, Dewey to help them. Dewey responds, are you kidding me? I've been stabbed 9 times. And I literally laughed out loud when he dropped that line. I don't know if I did on my initial watch, probably so, but I definitely did here on my rewatch because it's just such a great kind of meta call out of all the times that we thought, Dewey almost died in the franchise. Scream 1, Scream 2, you go on down the list there with what he's been through here in the franchise. But of course, once they leave, Dewey gets onto the phone and calls the one and only Sidney Prescott. Neve Campbell is back as well here, very much present in Scream 5. Not a ton of screen time, but every time she's there, you feel her impact, you feel her presence here in this movie for sure. He reveals to her that, it is happening again. And he says, do you have a gun? She says, I'm Sidney fucking Prescott. Of course I have a gun. Still a badass was my immediate reaction, to that line. As he calls her, she's pushing a stroller on a jog. So we reveal then that she has daughters, which we'll get to see more of here in Scream 7 once that comes out, and a husband named Mark. Also, we will learn more about here in Scream 7. But Dewey goes on to tell her, no matter what you see, no matter what you hear, don't come to Woodsboro. And Sidney states that she has no intention of ever coming back there. From there, we go back to the Meeks household, or I think it's Meeks Martin actually in this movie, which of course Chad and Mindy, as I talked about, being the nephew of Randy, which means that their mother is who? Martha Meeks. And we get Martha Meeks' return here for the first time since Scream 3. Sam has gotten the entire group together at the Meeks household, and Dewey does indeed show up there as well, despite, saying he wasn't going to help them, kind of goes back on that and does show up there to indeed help them. But she got the group together to form the entire, ensemble, that friend group, that she is Billy Loomis's daughter, which leads to another reveal of a death that we've had earlier in the movie. The Vince guy that was outside of the bar that we talked about earlier, they find out that he is the son of Leslie Mocker, Stu Mocker's sister. So then they realize that the first 3 victims that were attacked are all related to someone from the original Woodsboro murders, because you had Tara, Sam, and Vince all attacked, all being related to either Billy Loomis or Stu Macher in some type of way, which leads to Mindy realizing that the killer is either making a requel or a legacy sequel, which is very meta because that's obviously what we're watching here in Scream 5 is, either one of those you want to classify it as. And this is kind of the moment that we realize, oh, Mindy is kind of the new Randy. I mean, she's related to him, but she also loves horror movies, has a lot of knowledge, and, she goes through a rundown of kind of, legacy sequel and requel stuff as she would in kind of true Randy fashion, which I really do enjoy. But after this scene, we get to see, Wes returning back home to, his mom, Sheriff Judy, and, she's there. She has just ordered sushi. So she heads out to go pick up this, takeout sushi, leaving Wes at the house by himself. And then Ghostface, you're kind of expecting him to probably call Wes, who's back at the house, by himself. Instead, who does he call? He calls Sheriff Judy, who has left the house. And, that's a nice little fake out, in my opinion, as, we get a nice, brutal, kind of classic Ghostface line as he tells her, I'm going to gut your baby boy. And of course, she whips it around and tries to start calling Wes, but he's in the shower, so he doesn't answer. Cut back to Deputy Judy, now Sheriff Judy, of course, still in the car, gets another call from Ghostface. And I think that this is a great reference as well. Love this line and, kind of call back as he asks her, have you ever seen the movie Psycho? Cut back to Wes in the shower, and we get just the shot of the shower head, just like we got in the movie Psycho, which is a big pro for me, as I love that movie as well. And that's a nice callback to that one, a nice little Easter egg, if you will. Of course, Deputy Judy, now Sheriff Judy. I'm going to probably accidentally keep calling her Deputy Judy because I got Scream 4 on the mind because I just reviewed it yesterday. But Judy Hicks, the new sheriff, shows back up at the house and obviously parks the car, goes running into the house. And this is one of the best fake outs of the movie, in my opinion, because, you're expecting Wes to get it first. And instead, as she makes her way onto the porch, soon as she steps foot onto that porch, reaching for that front door, bam, Ghostface pops out, stabs her and takes out the sheriff right there, which I think is an awesome fake out. And the fact that we don't really have any, musical cues, anything leading up to it. It's just so abrupt and in broad daylight. I think that one really catches you off guard, especially the first time that you watch this movie. Even here on a rewatch, I completely, forgot about it and faked me out and gave me a nice little jump scare here in this one. But from there, we go into the house and where we get one of the best scenes that I think that the Radio Silence team put together in this movie, just because, Scream is always meta, and they kind of took that to, a different extent here, because they kind of accounted for the fact that, everyone watching this movie is probably not only a fan of Scream movies, but they're a fan of horror movies. So they know kind of what to expect in terms of, someone opens a mirror. When they close the mirror, somebody might be there. The killer might be there. When they open a door and then close the door, the killer might be on the other side. And a lot of times that's accompanied by even musical cues, a nice little stinger to kind of increase your chance of a jump scare in that moment. But instead, what do? They mess with the audience here. They toy with us as we expect Ghostface to pop up in those different places. And they even use those jump scare music cues to kind of fake us out as, it's behind a door that he opens and closes, on the other side of the fridge when he opens and closes it, and, even use the rule of 3 against us as, they do it more than 3 times, which is such a nice touch in my opinion. And I remember it getting, laughs the first time I saw this in theaters. And then it very much catches us off guard once Ghostface finally does pop out and take out Wes with a brutal kill of the stab of the neck, the knife through the neck rather. One of the more brutal kills in this movie, in my opinion, is the death of Wes. But really just kind of the lead up to that scene is what makes it so great, how they kind of toy with the audience. One of the better moments in a post-Wes Craven directed Scream movie, in my opinion. So with the death of Sheriff Judy and Wes together, it's a full-on crime scene there. And guess who shows up? Gail Weathers shows up there at the crime scene, and her and Sam are introduced to one another for the first time. And then, of course, Dewey ends up showing up there as well. And we get the kind of reuniting of Gail and Dewey. Gail essentially confronting Dewey, saying that, she showed up there because she was worried about him. And he, kind of questions that. And she said, well, her producers wanted to cover the story. She said, but it was 90% because she was worried about him. And this is where we get a little bit of backstory, a little bit of exposition on, kind of what happened with them when it's revealed that Dewey tried to move to New York with her, but after 2 months, he couldn't hack it and left in the middle of the night. And what was a surprisingly emotional reunion scene, in my opinion. Cut to one of the next scenes where we get Richie, who we know has been trying to catch up on the Stab movies. Now he's watching, a YouTube video that's kind of talking about Stab 8, which is just called Stab, much like the original Stab movie. And we get a nice kind of meta nod here of, why not just call it Stab 8? And I think it was a nice touch of the writers of this movie calling out how people would likely feel about the Scream 2022 title just being titled Scream versus being titled Scream 5. So definitely a very meta moment that, fits within this franchise, in my opinion. Cut back to the crime scene as Sam decides to, get in her car and race back to the hospital when she sees, one of the cops that was supposed to be protecting her sister back at the hospital show up there at the crime scene. So she feels like, oh, Ghostface is definitely going to show up there at the hospital and try and attack my sister. And Dewey jumps in the car and, heads off with her because, Dewey does what he does. Dewey's a protector and, he kind of got into this because of Sam, so he's kind of sticking with her at this moment, which back at the hospital, we get a nice Kevin Williamson Easter egg here, in my opinion, because Tara's watching Dawson's Creek, which, like I said, nice nod to Kevin Williamson as he was the creator of that show. And funny enough, it's the episode in, I think, season 1 where they do kind of the horror movie esque stuff there in Dawson's Creek, which is another nice touch, in my opinion. But Tara hears a noise in the hospital, so she leaves her hospital bed, although she's barely able to move. She has to get in a wheelchair to even be able to get around. Once she exits her room, she finds a security officer with his throat slit, and then heads into, another nearby room and attempts to, grab a phone off the wall to call someone when Richie pops up. And she asks, what are you doing here all of a sudden? And Richie claims that Sam called him because she was worried about Tara and asked, him to go there and check on her. But just as he, kind of starts to explain that, Ghostface pops out and slices Richie across the forearm, which leads to a chase scene between Ghostface and Tara. And of course, Tara, not hardly able to move, tries to roll away in the wheelchair. Ghostface comes after her, throws her out of the wheelchair. And just as, he's on top of Tara, looks like he's about to, finish the job that he, started in the opening of this movie, we get Dewey and Sam popping out at the perfect time, right out of the elevator as Dewey shoots Ghostface, who disappears briefly before then popping out again as they try and escort Tara to freedom. He attacks Dewey, and then a fight ensues with Dewey shooting Ghostface a couple of more times, and then gets Sam, Tara, and Richie back onto the elevator, and then kind of closing the door without hopping on the elevator with him. And they're like, why? And he's like, I've got to shoot him in the head or he always comes back, which is a nice reference, of course, as we've kind of become accustomed to that. So he heads back on his own after sending them off to safety to attempt to finish the job. Dewey's bravery on showcase yet again. But of course, as he heads back to, finish off Ghostface, instead, Ghostface pops out and stabs Dewey. And we've seen Dewey survive so many times. I think the movie felt like it had to, let us know, hey, he's not surviving this one. And to do that, Ghostface uses 2 knives, one on each side, stabs him, in the gut and the lower back, and then drags the knives all the way up, to his neck. So there's like, oh, we're like, that's it. Dewey's definitely, not surviving this one. And in my opinion, that's the one decision in this movie. Well, not the one decision, but the main decision in this movie that I didn't like when I first watched it. I still don't like it now. In my opinion, I love Dewey. He's such a good character here in this franchise. If you were going to kill Dewey or Gale, I think it should have been Gale, just in my opinion. I think Dewey should have been a mainstay still yet just as much as Sidney Prescott, but I'm biased because I've always loved the character of Dewey Riley. But that is the end of him here in this film in Scream 5, which leads to an emotional scene as Gale has to see him being wheeled out and realizing that, he is gone finally, and well acted by Courtney Cox as well in that moment. But Sidney, of course, then shows up at the hospital, despite Dewey's warnings. Once she hears of Dewey's death, you got to know that wasn't going to keep Sidney Prescott away. She was definitely going to come there at that moment. So, despite what she claimed earlier, she is here, and I'm glad that she is, because I'm glad that we get Sidney Prescott in the third act of this movie. That's kind of what puts it, over the top for me. If her one appearance would have just been that phone call with Dewey, it may have bumped the movie down a little bit for me personally, because, a Scream movie just doesn't feel like a Scream movie without Sidney Prescott, which we'll talk more about when we get to the next installment. But she tells Gail she came as soon as she heard. From there, we get Sam, Tara, and Richie kind of attempting to make their way out of the hospital as Sam stops Sidney. The two characters are introduced, and Sidney says, I want your help, Sam. I want to kill Ghostface because I can't go back to my family knowing he's still out there if he's not, in the ground. But Sam essentially tells her no. And I kind of like this touch of the movie because it's not something we get a lot, is them just planning to straight up leave Woodsboro and get the hell out of Dodge and run. Because, she says that she wants to protect her sister Tara, and she feels like the only way that she can help her is to leave Woodsboro. So Sidney essentially obliges, but as they leave, she tells Gail, I'll put a tracker on their car in what feels like a very much, a Gail Weathers move. So, Gail respects that, but they're definitely just trying to keep an eye on her because they feel like it's not going to be just as simple as them leaving and running, something Sidney's learned all too well throughout this franchise. And of course, as they're in the car attempting to make their way away from Woodsboro, Tara, the Jenna Ortega character, we learned early in the movie she has asthma, but she can't find her inhaler. And of course, she says, I keep an extra one at Amber's. So they have to stop there on their way out to pick up that extra inhaler, which while they're on their way to do that, Richie is completely against, funny enough. But they end up having to do that because Tara needs that inhaler. So they go to Amber's house. And once we see Amber's house in the next scene, we see that a party is going on there, which is in remembrance of Wes. They've kind of all got together to remember Wes, the character in this movie, not Wes Craven, but I guess you could take it twofold. Maybe that's a little bit meta as well. Never thought of it till just now, but makes sense, which this house, of course, will become our third act location. And the third act location being a house party is another great throwback to the original already before we get the reveal of what that house is, which we'll talk about here in just a moment. But back at that house party, Amber goes to the basement to get more beer in a scene that is eerily reminiscent of the Tatum death scene in the OG movie. I mean, you can, almost tell that it's the same fridge and safe basement as that original movie. But as she closes the fridge, instead of Ghostface being there, it's Mindy. And, Mindy tells her that was a test because Mindy's the one that asked her to go get more beer and that she shouldn't have went to the basement alone. So, we get Mindy here yet again being kind of the Randy Meeks type character, the voice of reason, kind of explain to them what they should and shouldn't do when a killer's on the loose, or should and shouldn't do in a horror movie for us in our meta context. And speaking of that meta context, we get a great scene here at that party as they're all watching the OG Stab movie, much like in the original Scream, they were watching the OG Halloween movie. And we see the scene pop up where Randy explains the rules, which is, very meta here in my opinion. And then not long thereafter, Chad and his girlfriend Liv have kind of gotten into an argument. Liv has kind of left, so Chad heads outside to look for her. And once outside, we go through this kind of whole use of modern technology like we talked about earlier, as she sends him this kind of tracking app so he can find her as she is texting him, although we find out it wasn't her. And when he follows that tracking app, it leads him up to some bushes, which kind of makes him feel skeptical. So he begins to, backtrack, but it's a little bit too late then. Ghostface pops out, stabs him in the leg, and then multiple times in the stomach. And this just led me to think, is he the new Dewey? Because he gets stabbed in multiple movies and survives. Spoiler alert for Scream 6, but we're going to talk about that in short order as well. But at this moment, we kind of think Chad's a goner, upon your first watch here in Scream 5. And why wouldn't you? He gets stabbed in the leg, then goes and hides, then, tries to run again, and Ghostface pops out, stabs him, multiple times in the gut. And then from there, Sam, Tara, and Richie arrive at Amber's house not long after, and Amber tells everyone that the party is over and clears out the house, which this is probably one of the other things that bumps me about this movie. Dewey's death being one, and then this being the other one of the only couple of knocks that I really have on this movie, probably, because I just don't understand why. Why did she clear out the party? I mean, we find out why, right, in the third act here later in the movie, but as far as, when you rewatch this, it just doesn't really make sense why she decided to clear out the party at that moment. Anyway, that leaves us with Liv, Mindy, Richie, Amber, Tara, and Sam left in this house. Liv then shows up in the living room with Mindy, who begins to suspect her, and a weird monologue from Liv attempts to kind of set her up as a red herring as Liv comes back into the living room. As you know, this movie doesn't do a ton of different, red herring setups, but that's certainly one. And I think a lot of the red herring setups come here in the third act. And from there, we cut to Sydney and Gail in their car trying to, track Sam, Tara, and Richie. And we see, Sydney checking the tracker and realizing where they are. They have, kind of a visceral reaction. We're like, oh shit, where are they? And so, Gail asks her, can we get there? And Sydney's like, not quick enough. So Sydney calls Sam and tells her to get out of the house because they are in Stu Macher's house. Even more meta. The house party in the third act was already meta enough, but then when we get this reveal that it's Stu Macher's house and the camera zooms out and we see that exact house that we knew from the OG Scream, I remember just absolutely being mind blown the first time I watched this movie. I thought that was such a good touch here in this one, that they are in Stu Macher's house. Amber's parents and Amber live in that house, which back there, Mindy is alone watching Stab, and we get a super meta moment here as well, as it's the scene in the OG Scream that we know of where Randy had Ghostface creep up behind him as he watched the original Halloween, where Michael Myers was creeping up behind Jamie Lee Curtis, and he was telling her to look behind her, look behind you, Jamie, look behind you. And we get Mindy kind of telling Randy to look behind him, and all of a sudden it just kind of clicks in her head and she turns around to look behind her too, and of course Ghostface is there and stabs Mindy. Sam finds her first, and so she's kind of down there on the ground with Mindy when Amber comes into the room and starts, questioning, what did you do to her? Because we already know from, earlier in this movie that Amber doesn't trust Sam as it is. Next, Richie then comes into the room, followed by Liv, who now has blood all over her hands. And, they've kind of already tried to set her up as a red herring in the last scene that we saw. And we also, had the tracking scene with her, phone kind of being the one to lure Chad into his stabbing that we saw earlier. So at this point, I think Liv is very much set up as a red herring, which kind of plays into everyone being skeptical of her. Although she is, of course, claiming that it's Chad's blood because she had discovered him. And also, if we think back to the last movie, the last time someone claimed that, they were indeed the killer. So I think that all of those things go into us questioning Liv in this moment, which sets up this reveal awesomely. As Amber tells Liv to stop, as she begins to plead, Liv says, fuck you, Amber, I'm not the fucking killer. And then Amber just abruptly responds, I know, while simultaneously pulling out a gun and shooting Liv directly in the head. I remember, in the first time that I watched this, that being like, oh shit, I didn't see that coming. And then even now, it still hits pretty good here, and I think it's still a pretty good reveal. And then we get Amber, just kind of letting us know, welcome to Act 3, as she actually says that line of dialogue, which I absolutely love that call out as well. Another super meta moment that really makes me love this movie. So, of course, at that point, everyone kind of runs away and scatters. Richie runs away with Sam before, telling her, hey, there's always two killers, and kind of makes Sam skeptical of him for a moment. So she kind of pulls out a knife, pointing it at him, but he tries to convince her that I think Tara may be the other killer, because Tara is the one that made them come to the house because she didn't have her inhaler at that moment. And, we don't know who the second killer is. So at that point, especially on your first time watching this movie, you're like, damn, Tara did make us come to this house. That is a good point. Right then, of course, Gail and Sydney finally arrive at the house as well. And just as they do, Amber comes running out of the house, pretending that she has been stabbed. And, Gail asks Sydney, what do you think? And Sydney says, trap. So love the smarts of, both Gail and Sydney, the badassery of Sydney that I always talk about. And then, Amber kind of hears this and says, fuck it, and begins shooting them, which leads to, Sydney firing back, but she misses Amber as Amber re-enters the house. But unfortunately, as Amber was shooting, she does hit Gail. So Gail is now, shot in the gut with a bullet. She's left out on the front lawn, and that leads to having Sydney enter the house alone here. From there, we see Sam hiding in an upstairs bedroom, and she finds Tara tied up in the closet. She goes to cut her free initially, and then we see her kind of stop as if she's skeptical, and we really don't ever know if she frees her or not, because we kind of cut away then to Sydney, who is getting a call from Ghostface, and Sydney calls Ghostface Amber, and Ghostface replies, I'm not Amber, I'm the other one. And Sydney says, oh, there's two of you. Again, I've seen this movie before. Another great line there from Sydney. Love that kind of self-referential moment. Sydney starts firing into closets as doors are closed upstairs, and she ends up shooting Richie in the leg, who is hiding in one of those closets. And then, not long after that moment, after she shoots Richie, Ghostface pops out from one of the other closets and grabs Sydney as they tumble back down the stairs. I'm going to get a funny line here from Richie. He says, "Holy shit, it's Ghostface." And that one still makes me laugh here in this movie. But they're down at the bottom of the steps. Sydney can't quite reach the gun. Here comes Richie coming down the steps now, obviously slowly as he's been shot in the leg. But Sydney tells him, get the gun as she's on the ground. He makes his way to do that, but can't get there fast enough because of his gunshot wound. And instead, we get the reemergence of Sam, who pops out and grabs the gun just before the person in the Ghostface costume can grab it. So Sam is standing there with the gun as Richie's now finally made his way down the steps, and he says, "Thank God you're okay," as he approaches Sam, and then immediately he stabs her in the side, and he says, "Because I'm the one who really wanted to kill you," which I think is another pretty good reveal there. At that point, I wasn't really expecting Richie either, so I think, you get two good Ghostface reveals in this one that caught me off guard. In my first watch of this movie, I would say Amber being Ghostface maybe was just a little bit more predictable, but that's only because I had already seen Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, and she was one of the Manson girls in that and played a pretty crazy role. And I think we get to see her go to that same level of crazy here in the third act once they are both revealed. So then Richie takes the gun from Sam, obviously, and, reveals that he had the inhaler all along as he pulls it out from his shirt pocket and says, "I can't believe that this actually worked." Amber pulls off her Ghostface mask and holds Sydney at gunpoint. And then, of course, they take Sam and Sydney into the kitchen. We got to go into the kitchen, man. We're recreating that OG Scream. We got to do it right. So they take him into the kitchen, and Richie, lets him know, hey, someone has to save the franchise. No one has made a really good stab movie since the first one, which I think is a great quote. He then tells Amber to go get the ex-Miss Riley, to go get Gail. And they say Hollywood was out of good ideas, so we figured we'd give them some better source material, make it based on true events again. As, we kind of learned that Richie and Amber are both, huge fans of the stab movies, and they hated the last one, as we've learned throughout the movie. A lot of people did. And so they're doing this to kind of give the makers of the next stab movie better source material to make a better movie, which is a crazy motive, but it works here in this movie, in my opinion, as they then reveal that their plan is to frame Sam because, of course, she is Billy Loomis's daughter. Amber says she's been obsessed with the stab movie since her parents bought Stumacher's house, and that she met Richie on a stab subreddit. But then they go on to detail, we had to bring the legacy characters back. And we get a great quote from Amber, "Can't have a bona fide Halloween without Jamie Lee." Love that quote as well. Of course, I'm biased with my love for the Halloween movies, but, those two are kind of one in the same. When you think of, all-time final girls, you think Jamie Lee Curtis, you think Neve Campbell. So I think it's a great quote as well. And another meta moment here in this movie as Amber stabs Sydney then, saying they don't plan to let her survive. Richie tells Sam she really should have listened to Dewey. He nailed it in one. Look at the love interest. And yet again, a great call out of, Dewey actually, being pretty smart throughout the franchise, although appearing otherwise at times. He's actually really clever, and he absolutely nailed it here early in this movie in our first appearance of Dewey. And I love that Dewey gets a little, heroic moment despite not being around in the film again. We do realize, oh shit, Dewey did call it early in this movie. So from there, Amber goes to find Tara, but she isn't where they left her, and she pops out and begins to beat Amber with her crutches. Sam then attacks Richie, who's kind of distracted hearing this, as they flee away. And when he goes to chase her, Gail and Sydney then fight with Amber. And that's a pretty cool fight in the kitchen, as it ends with Gail shooting Amber, which leads to her catching on fire via the eye of the stove, and she's burning up there. So pretty much we feel like Amber's disposed of at this point. And then we get Sam popping back out and attacking Richie upstairs as they begin to fight before they tumble back down the stairs as well. Sam is on the ground looking like, all hope is lost, kind of the all hope is lost moment here, essentially, with Richie approaching her. And what does she do? She looks up. There's a mirror on the wall. Guess who shows up again? The hallucination of Billy Loomis. And he kind of makes a gesture with his eyes to show her something, over by the window. And we see the handle of a knife, and she's kind of making her way to that knife. She grabs it, turns around, attacks Richie and uses it to stab him repeatedly with a ton of aggression. This is probably the most bloody kill in the movie because she ends up covered in straight blood. And we can see that she's very much Billy Loomis's daughter in this moment, which she drives that home with the great line of "never fuck with the daughter of a serial killer," as she ends it by slitting Richie's throat. And we get, a final badass moment there from Sam as Sydney and Gil exit the kitchen, walk into the living room there where they find her. And Sydney says, "Careful, they always come back," as we expect, Richie to pop back up. So Sam takes the gun and shoots Richie repeatedly so that he can't, come back for one last scare. But I think we get a good fake out here because it's not him that comes back for the final scare. It's burnt to crisp Amber that comes running out of the kitchen with the knife, but she is shot by Tara, who is in the adjacent hallway there, and takes her out and gets a nice line there, calling back to that, cold open in the beginning as Tara says, "I still prefer the Babadook," after shooting Amber, which I think is a good touch there as well. So from there, we get to see Mindy and Chad both wheeled out on stretchers and give each other a thumbs up. A final callback to the original Scream. Well, not the final. We got one more here. But of course, we had Dewey giving the thumbs up in the original Scream. This time we see Mindy and Chad both surviving, giving each other a thumbs up, which is a nice touch as they both have survived stabbings. Sam goes over to Sydney and Gail and thanks them and asks Sydney if she's going to be okay. Sydney tells her, "Eventually, you will." Sam gets on the ambulance with Tara, telling her she's not going anywhere without her, as the camera zooms out from Stu's house and a reporter is giving a report on what had happened throughout that night. Very reminiscent of the OG Scream and our final callback to that movie, but a perfect callback as we had Gail Weathers giving that report in the original as the camera panned out. And now in this one, we have another reporter giving that report as the camera pans out. A final callback to the OG Scream. This movie's full of them, and I absolutely love that about it. I'm a huge fan here of Scream 5, Scream 2022, whatever you want to call it. If you can't understand that by, me waxing poetic enough, if you didn't pick up on that throughout this review, but I really do love this one. It's one of my favorite Scream sequels personally. And as far as the rating is concerned, there are a couple of things that maybe knock it a couple of points. I think I touched on them there. The death of Dewey, which I still personally don't agree with. Would love to still have him around in the franchise, even though we will get David Arquette back in Scream 7 in some capacity, which is great. And then, of course, Amber deciding to clear out the party when Sam, Tara, and Richie arrive, which, at the end, when you realize she's one of the Ghostface, it makes sense, but there's just really no legitimate reason for it other than that. So I think that knocks it a little bit for me as well. So I'll take 2 points off for that, but other than that, still a phenomenal Scream sequel, in my opinion. As far as my rating here for Scream 5, 8 out of 10. Like I said, big fan of this one. Love Scream 5, love all the choices they made in here, and I'm a sucker for those callbacks to the original, as you guys know how much I love the original Scream. So this one might be a little bit more lengthy than some of the other reviews, but I knew I had a lot to talk about here, a lot to wax poetic about in Scream 2022, Scream 5, whatever you want to call it. But you've heard my thoughts on it. I'd love to hear yours as well. Still got one more movie to review in the lead up to our Scream 7. And be sure you catch the other reviews that I've dropped in the lead up to that movie as well, as we now have 5 down, 1 more to go before we get to Scream 7. Can't believe it's about that time. Get it up, baby. We're about to be at Scream 7. Can't wait for it, guys. One of my most anticipated in quite a while. But you've heard my thoughts on this movie. Let me know some of yours down in the comment section. How do you feel about 2022 Scream, or anything you want to talk about there within the genre? Always enjoy chatting movies with you guys, and I appreciate you guys tuning into this one, and I will catch you on the next one.